I was walking my dog, and I ran into another dog walker, and I said simply, "How are you?" And she said, "I'm fine." And then she kind of backtracked and she said, "I mean, you know." And I said, "Yes, I know, the world. It's hard to be fine these days." And she said, "Yes, but it's just what you say." I remember once, some years ago, before this difficult moment in time, someone asked me how I was, and I was really struggling at that time. And I was honest. I told them the truth. And she looked at me and said, more than I wanted to know. I felt terrible. I felt embarrassed. My story unwanted. And I'm wondering tonight, as I look around this Zoom room, those of you I can see and those of you who I can imagine, how are you? What do you say when you're asked? How are we? 9 months deep in the midst of a pandemic that is at this moment becoming more frightening each day, recovering from the most contested presidential election in American history, facing the worsening consequences of climate change. With all that, how are we? How are we indeed? Not to mention the normal struggles, conflicts, griefs, and losses of human life, which in themselves can be so much to carry, so much weight to bear. Even before all this started, I thought life was difficult. And to whom can we tell our truths of how we really are? I mean, who wants to listen to the real story with pain and shame and joy and sadness and loneliness and blessing and curse? I mean, everything. As one of the characters in the film Zorba the Greek says, the full catastrophe. Well, there's an incredible moment in this week's Parsha with Rachel, our foremother, unable to tell her story. In fact, she lies to her father, Lavan. Here's the story. Jacob, after living in his father-in-law's house for about 20 years, took his wives, the sisters, Rachel and Leah, the competitors really, their handmaidens, Bilhah and Zilpah, and all his children, and all the wealth they had, or he had accumulated during those years, and ran away. Lavan ran after him, catches up with him, and accuses him of stealing his household gods. Now, we know, although Jacob doesn't and Lavan doesn't, that Rachel had earlier stole her father's household gods when he was out sheep shearing. So what are these household gods? Well, it seemed to be the accepted custom in Mesopotamia for every family to have gods. There's nothing specific known about how big they were, how small they were, what they were. Sometimes they were human figurines. We're really not sure. But we will find out a little more about them and what they mean about inheritance a little later. So meanwhile, Lavan is frantic about his gods. He looks all over Jacob's tent. He looks all over Leah's tent and the tents of the handmaidens, and finally he enters Rachel's tent. You could feel the dramatic tension heighten. The Torah tells us that they are in the saddlebag of her camel, and Rachel is sitting right on top of them. Lavan feels everywhere for them and can't find them. So what does she say to her father? Let not my Lord be angry that I cannot get up in your presence, for the way of women is upon me. And he searched, but he did not find the teraphim. The teraphim is the Hebrew word for household gods. Vatomer el aviha, al yichar be'enei Adoni, ki lo uchal lakum mipanecha, ki derech nashim li, v'yichapes v'lo matzah et hatrafim. She uses the quote, unquote, way of women to keep her father away from her. She wields the power and the ostensible impurity of the female body to scare her father away. And she's entirely successful, for she keeps him away from the household gods they both so clearly desire. So why did Rachel lie? And why did she steal these gods to begin with? What led her to this moment? I think it's worth retracing Rachel's steps here. We first meet Rachel in this Parsha at the well, like we meet so many other women in the Torah. And of course, it's a courtship scene. So one day she goes out to the well with her father's sheep, and Jacob sees her, and he runs over to her, he kisses her, and he begins to cry. I can only imagine that she's thinking, who is this guy? Why is he crying? And what does he want from me? We see in verse 20 of that same chapter, which I think is chapter 29, but I forgot to note it, that Jacob loves Rachel, but we have no idea how Rachel feels about him. In fact, we're never told whether she loves him or not. So we can only imagine that the feeling is not mutual, or maybe that the Torah doesn't care about women's feelings. Not sure which. Indeed, Jacob's words to Lavan about marrying Rachel are really not so pretty. He says, give me my wife because my days are complete, meaning he worked a long time for her. And I want to come into her. I want to lay with her. Nothing about love, nothing about wanting to build a life with her, and nothing about what she wants. To me, these words read as simply exploitative, not at all about love. And what does her father do? Many of us here will know the famous story that on Rachel's wedding night, her father Lavan switched her with her sister Leah, and Jacob married Leah. So, and again, we have no idea how Rachel felt about that. We do know that Jacob was plenty mad. So for Rachel's father, Lavan, his daughters are pawns in a game of power with Jacob. We further see that Rachel is unable to have children, and she's envious of her sister and absolutely desperate to have children. She says to Jacob, give me children or I die. Jacob is a bit of a jerk in his response. Instead of comforting her or reassuring her, like his father before him, when Isaac reassured Rebekah and prayed on her behalf, he says, am I in God's stead? Who is withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So basically he blames it on her. And then when Jacob decided finally after 20 long years to leave Laban's house, here's how Rachel and Leah describe their experience in their father's household. They say, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not like foreigners to him? For he has sold us and has eaten up our money. And the word used, the Hebrew word used for foreigners, nochriot. So they are unrecognizable to their father, unrecognizable. Clearly, Rachel and Leah feel alienated in their father's home, that there's nothing there for them. Piecing together Rachel's story, we understand more about why Rachel had to lie to her father. She is his pawn, and he acts like she belongs to him. He gives her nothing. And finally, she's unrecognizable to him. He's uninterested in who she really is as a separate human being in her own right, unable to see her for the person, the woman that she is. How could she possibly tell him her truth? He clearly isn't listening. But the story gets even more interesting as we consider the meaning of these traphim, these household gods. In 14th century BCE, tables or tablets of Nuzi, an ancient city in Iraq, indicate that traphim, household gods, were associated with clan leadership and inheritance rights. That gives us an incredible window into the literary pattern of Genesis. If Rachel is stealing her inheritance rights from her father and from her older sister, then she is behaving exactly as Jacob behaved in his family, stealing the birthright from his older brother, Esau. And I would dare to say, my own midrash, is that Rachel stealing these household gods represent her claiming her own spiritual life, I mean, why would she be praying to the God of Jacob, right? Jacob describes his God as the God of his father. I can't imagine giving his relationship with his wives that he was actually sharing his spiritual life with them. And she uses this incredible sentence to her father to describe the way of women being upon her. Ki derech nashim li, the path of women is mine. Maybe this is actually the lie that tells the truth. Maybe here, Rachel is claiming her own power, claiming an alternative spiritual life. It seems like the only thing, perhaps, that is truly hers. So with this act of robbery and this lie, what is she claiming? Her power, her inheritance rights, a place, a space for her own spiritual life, her own body and its workings, the sanctity of its rhythms and its ways. She claims the path of women for herself. This moment reminds me rather painfully of my own journey. I come from, as many people at Roman know, a traditional community of Syrian Jews in Brooklyn. Girls were not expected to work outside the home, much less become rabbis. They were expected to get married at 18, move around the corner from their parents, and have children pretty early on. For the 6 years I was in rabbinical school, my parents told their friends that I was, quote unquote, studying. They never said what. That was the lie that covered the truth of my seeking to lay claim to my own spiritual journey and legacy. In my first year of rabbinical school, I wrote an essay about what it meant to become the first Syrian Jewish woman to become a rabbi. And here's a little clip. I was having dinner at my parents' house with a friend of theirs, Denise. Denise asked me if I was going to go to graduate school, what my plans were. Yes, I said. What school, she asked. I said, the Jewish Theological Seminary. She said, you're not going to become a rabbi, are you? God forbid, I said, with as much shock as I could muster. The situation was so replete with irony that introducing sarcasm into my lies felt like the only possible way to tell the truth. Like this was some kind of joke between me and God. Good, she says. I know a woman at the JCC where I swim, and she's actually studying to become a rabbi. Her tone was full of distaste. Can you imagine? I could barely imagine. Perhaps when Rachel said, Derech Nashim li, mine is the path of women, or the path of women is mine, she knew somewhere inside her that she was telling the truth, that she too was having a joke with God, a secret joke from the men around her, from the patriarchy that defined her life and disempowered her. So that's Rachel. That's her power. That's her spiritual life. That's her legacy. She bequeathed it to us. She surreptitiously claimed her legacy so we could clearly claim ours. So here's my question to all of us. Do you have a hidden story that you're scared to tell? Do you have a hidden spiritual life? Is part of you closeted because you're afraid of rejection, of judgment, of your family, of your friends? And here's my second question to all of us. How are we listening? Are we making the unexpected story tellable by our listening? When we say, how are you? Do we mean it? Are we, as a 20th century feminist theologian Nell Morton says, listening one another to speech, into speech? How can we begin to tell the collective and personal unwanted stories that are hidden beneath the surface? I would say by practicing storytelling, our own, by revealing bits and pieces of the stories we are scared to share. By practicing storytelling, our people's, whether it's the American story or the Jewish story, with all its attendant complexity, the light and the dark, the beauty and the brutality. By finding listeners who are willing to listen to a story beyond, I'm fine. By becoming listeners of the unwanted story, by opening ourselves up to the hidden pieces of one another, those pieces that are scared of judgment. Do you have a story that is unwanted? So let me ask you again, how are you? How are we? Are you ready to say more? Are you ready to tell at least some of the truth? Are you ready to listen? Shabbat Shalom.